This week we saw the release of the lockdown files, a massive leak of a cache of data of Matt Hancock's communications within government at the time of lockdown. And to delve deeper into this topic, we have Dr. David Starkey himself. David, Boris Johnson used the analogy of war to describe the COVID pandemic and to justify the emergency powers that he used for measures. How accurate was this analogy, and do you think it was right that and proper parliamentary scrutiny was abandoned? MPs, after all, did vote in the emergency powers.
I think the use of the war analogy is where everything went wrong. The moment you claim something is a war, you, as it were, say everybody should get behind it. This is a matter of total national security. Dissent becomes treason. It is not the way that you conduct ordinary politics. And by the way, just to fan out from that, it seems to me to be exactly what's going wrong with how we're dealing with the so-called climate emergency. The moment you claim it's an absolute emergency, that we're facing desperate circumstances, that it's a war on global warming, you stop thinking, you stop reflecting, you stop debating, you stop telling the truth. And we did all of that during lockdown. So I think the war analogy is where absolutely everything went wrong. Because, of course, I'm afraid something else goes along with that. You use propaganda. The first victim of war is truth. And there's another thing which I think, again, we need to put right down up there, up front. A state of permanent war was identified by George Orwell in 1984 as how the party maintained its control. It's the basis of that monstrous regime of 1984, which is permanent war. No one's quite sure in 1984, a bit like COVID actually, whether the war is real, whether the bombs that are falling, the rockets that are falling in London may actually be being dropped by the regime to maintain this perpetual sense of tension and danger. And of course, 1984 is also about the sacrifice of truth. What is the Ministry of Propaganda called? It's called the Ministry of Truth, which lies the whole of the time. And what we had during lockdown, it's now clear, Calvin, and it's profoundly shocking, is we had government by lies, by deliberate, calculated, coordinated lies. The lockdown files, I think, are the most disgraceful set of documents ever released, as it were, of British public life. They display an utter corruption of our politics. Interesting enough, you know what? Again, one person, you mentioned Boris Johnson, one very few people that emerges with any kind of credit is Johnson himself. There are two things that strike about, they're all WhatsApp messages. There are two things that strike about Johnson's messages. First, they are immeasurably more literate than everybody else's. Here is somebody who is reading, God, I'm going to say astonishing things about Boris. Here is somebody who's reading, is thinking, is criticizing the information that he's receiving, but he's not doing it enough. He lacks the confidence to carry it through. The other thing that's utterly shocking is that these are the activities of a conservative government, of a government that is supposedly committed to Britain, to England, to our astonishing record of personal freedom, to a light touch from the state, to a police which is not a police state, but is supposedly an arm of the citizenry and there only to enforce the law, not current government policy. All of those were simply thrown out of the window. This is because you have conservatives, and I'm afraid here Boris is as guilty as everybody else, who aren't, have got no grounding, have got no roots, don't really know why they're there. Disgrace.
Well, you touched on a lot of important topics there. The idea of perpetual war, which I would suggest the West is engaging in right now. The Ministry of Truth, pushing forward propaganda. We could look at the Nudge Unit and the Trusted News Initiative and all of that. But I think going back to the source of a lot of this, government not just government, Parliament gave up the idea of being able to dissent, gave up the idea of being able to challenge the government in voting in these emergency powers. Why do you think they did that in the first place, undermining proper parliamentary procedure?
For the simple reason it's war. Remember, in the Second World War, ordinary democratic politics were suspended. You had a coalition government. Everybody pulled in together because the important thing was to defeat the Germans. I mean, at least as much responsible for everything that went wrong as the government is, of course, the opposition. The utterly craven behavior of Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer, I'm afraid, as we know now, really loves control. He really loves controlling things. He was in his absolute element with lockdown. If you'll remember, every day he got up and he called for more of it. He called for it to go on longer. He called for it to go on and be more intense. And by the way, so did another organisation that prides itself on its liberalism, the BBC. The BBC was ranting day in, day out. Why isn't the government doing more? Why isn't it paying attention to, of course, this mysterious thing called the so-called science, which we can now see was an utter panic-stricken fabrication based on bad science, worse mathematics, and disgraceful argument. But essentially, the media, all of this went wrong because not simply did the government panic, the media and particularly the opposition panicked. And the person who panicked most of all, and panicked with pure, cynical, self-regarding calculation, was Nicola Sturgeon. And in other words, the levels of disgrace in this, Calvin, and it disgraces our whole public life. What I think, dare I say, shall we get together and boast, one of the very few news outlets that gave voices from the other side any space at all was ours, was GBNews. But equally, the channel made a terrible mistake. It gave too much credit to those who were going on about, problems with vaccines and all the rest of it. That is just indiscriminate conspiracy theory. It seems to me vastly more important, and what would have been vastly more effective would have been to follow the example of Jonathan Sumption and, dare I say, yours truly, and focused on the issue of lockdown and its outrageous challenge to fundamental British liberties.
Okay. Where I would disagree with you is that on our focus on the vaccines. I don't think we talked enough about the vaccines and the potential damages, to be honest with you, but you're right, we should have been focusing also on the lockdowns, and I think we were to some degree. But you mentioned that they were based on bad science, and a lot of these decisions were based on bad science. Would you acknowledge that actually a lot of these decisions were based on politics rather than science at all? For example, masks in schools, the closing of schools, the second lockdown and the other lockdowns following that, and Boris Johnson has alleged that it was the wrong data, but is it a case of there wasn't data considered and this was just politics?
I think there's a very strong element of truth in what you say. I think once the thing got going, once people were panicked, once the opinion polls started saying, oh, people actually want more, because of course people were frightened. This wasn't nudging, this was panicking. This was actually designed to produce panic and fear, the characteristic, as it were, reactions in war, the characteristic psychological reaction in flight, and deliberately designed to suppress dissent. But I do think, Calvin, we do need to go back to the fundamental. The reason that this went so hideously, completely wrong was bad science. One of the people, again, who should be held up to disgrace and blame is Neil Ferguson at Imperial College. His calculations on every epidemic have been out by factors of between 10 and 100. Or 1,000. He was responsible for the panic over foot and mouth. He was responsible for the so-called mad cow disease panic. All of these, of course, were veterinary diseases which inflicted terrible suffering on the farming community. I vividly remember I was filming at the time in the West Country around Bristol, and we couldn't film because of the stink and smoke of burning cow corpses. It was disgusting. What his miscalculations did wanted this time was to lead to human tragedy, financial tragedy, and, dare I say, the dislocation and disgrace of our political system. But of course, he was aided and abetted from within the government. And he was aided and abetted in two ways. Again, a huge burden of responsibility rests on Dominic Cummings. Cummings comes out disgracefully in this as a perpetual proponent of panic. In other words, he imagined that he understood the mathematics. It's perfectly clear that he didn't. The other source of that panic, it seems to me, was, of course, dare I say it, the behavior of other European governments. I mean, Italy and France. I mean, the weekend, that March weekend, when we shifted from what was clearly a completely rational policy of herd immunity, exactly what Sweden did, to this grotesque business of lockdown. It was direct pressure from Macron. It was photographs of what were going on in Italian hospitals, and again, a media generated panic. So there's the really bad maths, but there's another reason why bad maths. You've then got to ask a question, Calvin. Why does such obviously bad maths work? And the answer is, do you know what? Because most of our media cannot do arithmetic, and hardly any of our politicians can do basic arithmetic either. I mean, I remember vividly, I appeared, not on this channel, I appeared, I think it was, do you know what? It might even have been the BBC. Those dim and distant days before I was cancelled. And I remember I was on air. I remember vividly with the two people, with Anne Soubry and Sir Roger Gale, one of these preposterous Tory backwoodsmen. And they were both proponents of absolute panic. And I challenged them. I said, actually, if you look at the figures, this isn't a terribly severe pandemic, as it indeed demonstrated it wasn't terribly severe. There was, in fact, astonishingly little shift in the daily death tolls. And of course, I said to them, do you actually realize how many people die each day? I said, well, about 1,600, which means about 10,000 die every week. Oh, those figures can't possibly be right. How disgraceful of you to say so. You know, this is the problem. When you have members of the political class who can't even calculate, if you've got a population of 65 plus million, then about 500,000 people are going to die every year, which is why, of course, when you use those figures, it's so easy to panic people. And it's a shocking, I'm sorry, let's add to our list of disgraces. It's the great failure of our educational system that, you know, it doesn't teach people to have a basic confidence about number. In the days when I used to teach history, I was always going on to people, you know, what you need is an order of magnitude. You didn't need to be doing simultaneous equations or the calculus. All you need mostly is a sense of number, basic addition and multiplication and subtraction, and, you know, to know that if 1,600 people die every day, then 10,000 die every week, and roughly 500,000 die every year. Similarly, that, you know, in the early modern period, France 4 or 5 times the size of England with a multiplier of the population. Simple things like that. But if you have a political class which doesn't have that basic understanding, a media that doesn't have that basic understanding, then of course charlatans triumph.
Is it a case that they didn't have the understanding? Because of course these death numbers were put out there, and it's very abstract, not quite, as you point out, unless you know the average death numbers on a day-to-day basis. How do you know if it's any different? Where do you know? Where's the relative number there? And it was never given. And Boris Johnson did say he wanted to end lockdown earlier, but he was afraid it was too far ahead of public opinion, which suggests to me that once they put Project Fear in place, they didn't know how to reel it back. Is that not the problem here? You know, Bill Gates has a book out, How to Lie with Statistics. Is it not the case that the media and the government were all involved in this propaganda, and they purposefully obscured these numbers to make people afraid?
I think that's probably true. I mean, but isn't it again, the things, Calvin, that our education used to furnish you with? Do you remember the wonderful story of the sorcerer's apprentice who, as it were, teaches himself a spell to draw water? So the bucket goes to the well and pours water automatically. Unfortunately, he forgot to learn a spell to tell it how to stop. And it's exactly the same once you launch what we can call Operation Panic. How do you stop it? What then happens is, of course, again, our Bible, going back to the Gadarene rush starts, and how, once the herd of pigs have got that passion in them, they all charge over the cliff. We all charged over the cliff of lockdown, over the cliff of furlough, with the disastrous consequences that we can see. I mean, this is why I think, disgraceful, and that's a very, very mild word, though Isabel Oakeshott's behaviour may have been. This should do good, but it will only do good if, rather than picking on individuals, we ask ourselves the absolutely fundamental question: what does this say about what's gone wrong with the way that we run ourselves? I mean, if you think about it, I've been giving a very negative view of it, which
it's not like you.
It corresponds to my horror, and I hope I've been conveying genuine horror, because I think it is utterly disgraceful. But there's another positive way of looking at this, which is that the way that in theory we do our business, with public debate, with the ability either on the floor of the House to challenge ministers, or through select committees and so on to challenge the so-called expert, that is the right way of doing it. The wrong way of doing it is when you engender this panic, create, again, not even the cabinet was consulted. We used, and this is also utterly shocking, we used the models of wartime government when you effectively create a war cabinet. And that war cabinet consisted effectively of Boris Johnson, of Matt Hancock, and I think, Rishi Sunak, and I'm afraid disgracefully Michael Gove, who was one of the leading panickers. And this again, it's really very important we say this. His well-known ability to get things done was turned to utterly malign ends. But the other thing that, again, you've got a war cabinet, but surely we have a cabinet office, we have a civil service. That is behaviour of the civil servants involved. I mean, the emails from, or rather WhatsApp messages from the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, if anything, they're more vulgar, they're more schoolboyish, they're more jejune, even than those of Matt Hancock. This is somebody who simply is not up to the job.
All of that is absolutely outrageous. It's I happen to think that Dominic Cummings is a genius at campaigning. I think Michael Gove is a genius at instilling his political will. And like you say, the unfortunate situation here is that they made themselves an executive, along with Matt Hancock, who I wouldn't say is a genius at anything, but they made themselves entirely undemocratic, and they made an executive power that is unchallengeable. And the people, the civil servants working for them, were hypocrites. Therefore, the question, David, is how do we avoid this kind of situation happening ever again?
The only answer, I'm afraid, is to appoint better politicians, or to elect better politicians. I think, and I'll go back to the point that I made right at the beginning about Boris Johnson, I think he comes out of this as a sort of tragic hero. Here is somebody who had all the right instincts in these circumstances. Boris is a natural libertarian. He is profoundly skeptical of jargon. He's profoundly skeptical of why he was, as it were, both right and wrong about Brussels and so on. But he lacked the courage of his convictions. He lacked the will. He lacked the force. If you remember, in exactly similar circumstances, when he was so often overwhelmed with facts, figures, and whatever, there is Churchill. Churchill, of course, understood science far better than Boris, and he doesn't apparently coin the phrase, but he constantly uses it, that you want scientists on tap, not on top. Because again, the final false lesson of all of this is the heresy of worshipping the expert. and particularly the one issue expert. The reason that the SAGE committee was so utterly disastrous was the reason that the Climate Change Committee is utterly disastrous. The reason, I would argue, that the Monetary Policy Committee is utterly disastrous. The reason that Nature England under Tony Juniper is disastrous, because they're single issue committees. The only person speaking rationally, apart from Boris, and of course he's not in this group very conspicuously, and hardly anything of the current Prime Minister appears in this, very strikingly, I think. But the whole problem was that nobody was actually speaking within government saying, well, what's the cost of lockdown? What's the literal cost in terms of money, the tens, hundreds of billions that were thrown away on FOLO? What is the cost in terms, I mean, Gavin Williams doing a tiny little bit. What is the cost in children's education? And above all, because of course Hancock was also Secretary of State for Health, nobody's saying what is the cost of the deranged decision to make the National Health Service a national COVID service, to ignore heart disease, to ignore dementia, to ignore cancer. I mean, just it's the problem of a false notion of expertise and a worship of single issue committees. And far too much of our public life is dominated by them. Again, a proper Conservative government would break the power of these things. It's what is so beautiful about our parliamentary system working properly. It involves debate. It involves weighing. You know, there's no such thing as a good decision. All decisions are just less bad, because human life is complex, and you have to weigh often incommensurables against each other. We devised, because again of the notion of war, of total war, we devised a system with none of the checks and balances which British government pioneered, for which it's been famous, but which it appears, alas, to have abandoned.
If we want the system to survive, we have to use the system properly. I'm with you entirely, David. This is a disgrace, and all of these people are a disgrace. David Starkey, thank you very much. See you next week.
A pleasure.